The moment Irene Sawyer stepped off the stagecoach in Dustcreek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, a tumbleweed rolled directly into her path, as if the whole town were trying to warn her that she had made a terrible mistake. She stood there on the sun-baked Main Street with one battered leather trunk, a hatbox that had seen better days, and a letter of employment clutched in her gloved hand. The letter was from a man named Gerald Holt, owner of the Silver Spur Saloon and boarding house, who had promised her work as a seamstress and general housekeeper in exchange for room and board plus a modest weekly wage. What the letter had not promised, and what Irene discovered within the first 5 minutes of her arrival, was that Gerald Holt had died of a heart attack 3 weeks prior, and his nephew Clem had taken over the establishment with entirely different ideas about what kind of women he wanted working for him. "You want me to do what?" Irene asked, her voice perfectly steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Clem Holt leaned against the bar with a wide, unpleasant grin and looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. He was a thick-necked man with a red face and small eyes the color of dirty creek water. "The girls here do more than sew buttons, sweetheart. You want the room, you earn it our way." Irene picked up her trunk, her hatbox, and her dignity, and she walked right back out into the afternoon sun. She stood in the middle of the street, squinting against the light and trying very hard not to cry. She was 24 years old. She had left her family's ruined farm in Missouri with $43 and a fierce determination to build something for herself, and she was now in a town she had never been to, with no employer, no lodgings, and the sun beginning its slow descent toward the flat horizon. "You look like a woman who just discovered the ground she was standing on was quicksand." The voice came from her left. Irene turned and found a man leaning against the post of the general store, arms crossed and one boot propped up on the base of the wooden sidewalk. He was somewhere in his late 20s, tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical work rather than any particular vanity about it. His hat was the dark brown of worn leather, pushed back on his head in a way that was either careless or deliberately casual. His jaw carried a few days of stubble, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that made Irene think of the sky just before a good rain. "I am minding my own business," she said, because it was the first thing that came to her mind, and also because she did not particularly want to be looked at with that much attentiveness right at this moment. "Didn't say you weren't," the man said. He pushed off from the post and walked toward her, unhurried, pulling his hat brim down slightly against the sun. "I saw you come out of the Silver Spur looking like you wanted to set something on fire. That tells me you met Clem Holt." "That is also my business," Irene said. "Sure it is. I'm Milton Ralston." He extended his hand with a straightforwardness that was somehow more respectful than a bow would have been. She hesitated only a moment, then shook it. "Irene Sawyer. You got somewhere to stay, Miss Sawyer. I'm working on it. The boarding house on Creek Road is run by Dora Finch. She's a fair woman and she doesn't ask more than what's owed. It'll cost you $4 a week, but the sheets are clean and she serves breakfast." Irene looked at him with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned that helpful men often wanted something in return. Milton Ralston seemed to read that look clearly, because he took half a step back and held up both hands briefly in a gesture that was almost amused. "I run the livery at the south end of town," he said. "I've got no stake in Dora's boarding house. I'm just telling you what I know." She studied him for one more moment. Then she picked up her trunk and her hatbox. "Which direction is Creek Road?" He pointed, and she walked. She did not look back, but she was aware in that particular way a person is sometimes aware when someone is watching them, not intrusively, but steadily, the way you watch a hawk cross the sky because something about the movement is worth watching. Dora Finch was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner that Irene found enormously comforting after the ugliness of Clem Holt's saloon. She showed Irene a small, clean room with a window that looked out over a scraggly garden, agreed to give her 2 weeks' credit on the room while she found work, and served her a plate of cold cornbread and beans that was, at that moment, the best meal Irene could remember eating. The next morning, Irene set out to find herself a legitimate livelihood. Dustcreek was not a large town, but it was a growing one. The railroad had come through the county 2 years prior, which had brought new settlers, and with them, new money and new needs. There was a land office, a doctor's surgery, a blacksmith, the general store where she had seen Milton Ralston standing the previous afternoon, a church that looked like it was still being built, the Silver Spur Saloon, Dora Finch's boarding house, and a small school that currently lacked a teacher. It was the school that caught Irene's attention. She had been educated through her 15th year before the farm's decline had made that impossible, and she had kept reading on her own ever since, borrowing books whenever she could, and teaching herself more than she had ever been formally taught. She went to find the man who served as both mayor and postmaster, a thin, nervous-looking fellow named Arthur Belk, and she inquired about the teaching position. "The town needs a teacher badly," Arthur Belk admitted, pressing his fingers together. "The last one, a Mr. Evans, left in January to follow the silver rush north. We've got 18 children who haven't been in a proper classroom since winter." "I am qualified," Irene said firmly, which was not entirely true in any formal sense but was true in the way that mattered, which was that she was more qualified than anyone else currently available. Arthur Belk looked at her carefully. "The pay is $12 a month. Comes with use of the schoolhouse for living quarters until a proper teacher's cottage can be built. $12 a month." She nearly wept with relief. "I accept." She moved into the small back room of the schoolhouse that afternoon. It was barely larger than a closet, but it had a cot and a small iron stove and a hook on the wall for her coat, and it was hers, and no one could take it from her. She spent the rest of the day organizing the schoolroom, which was dusty and disorganized, but possessed of a surprisingly decent collection of McGuffey readers, a globe that was only slightly inaccurate, and a blackboard that needed only a good cleaning. She was on her knees scrubbing the schoolhouse floor when she heard boots on the threshold. "I heard you took the teaching job." She looked up to find Milton Ralston standing in the doorway, hat in hand this time, which was either good manners or an instinctive understanding that he was in a schoolroom and that schoolrooms demanded a certain decorum. "Word travels fast in a small town," she said, sitting back on her heels. "It does." He looked around the room with an appraising eye. "Evans left this place a mess. He was a good enough teacher, but he didn't care much for tidiness." "Do you have children in school?" she asked. "No, I'm not married." He said it simply, without any particular weight on the words, and yet they seemed to settle in the air of the room the way dust motes settle when a window is opened. "My younger brother Bobby's boy comes, though. Tom, he's 9, sharp kid. I'll look forward to meeting him." Milton turned his hat over in his hands once. "I just wanted to say, if you need anything while you're getting settled, the livery isn't far. I keep a full stock of tools and I know most everyone in town." Irene stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "Why are you being kind to me, Mr. Ralston?" He looked directly at her, which was a thing she had already noticed he did, not evasively and not with any attempt to charm, just directly, as if he thought honesty was simpler than anything else. "Because you walked out of Clem Holt's place with your chin up when most people in your situation would have been frightened into staying. I thought that deserved some consideration." She did not know exactly what to say to that. So she said, "Thank you, Mr. Ralston," and he nodded, put his hat back on and left. She stood in the middle of her newly scrubbed schoolroom for a moment, listening to his boots on the dry ground outside, and felt something shift very slightly in the tight, anxious knot that had lived in her chest since Missouri. The school opened on a Monday morning in early April, and all 18 children showed up, which Irene took as a good sign. They ranged from 6 to 14 in age and varied enormously in what they already knew. Tom Ralston was indeed sharp, a dark-haired boy with his uncle's direct gaze, and a habit of asking questions that were more perceptive than anyone expected from a 9-year-old. He sat in the second row and watched Irene with the unsettling attentiveness of a child who is trying to figure out whether a new person is trustworthy. By the end of the first week, he had apparently decided she was, because on Friday afternoon he lingered after the others had gone and asked her if she had ever read the poems of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. "I have," she said, genuinely surprised. "My uncle reads them," Tom said. "He has a whole book. He reads to me sometimes when I stay over at the livery." Irene filed this information away without comment, though she found it interesting in a way she did not fully examine. By the second week, she had established a routine. She taught from early morning until mid-afternoon, then spent the late afternoon preparing the next day's lessons, then walked to Dora Finch's boarding house for dinner, because the schoolhouse had no proper kitchen. It was on one of these evening walks that she encountered Clem Holt for the second time. He was coming out of the Silver Spur in the company of 2 other men, and he blocked her path with the deliberateness of a man who has been drinking and who has a long memory for grudges. "The school teacher," he said, grinning, "too good for honest work." "Please move aside," Irene said. "I don't think I will just yet." He leaned toward her. "You ought to know, not everyone in this town is going to be as patient with your high-and mighty ways as I've been." "High and mighty isn't what I'd call it," said a voice from behind her. Milton Ralston came to stand beside her, not in front of her, which she noticed, not positioning himself as a shield but as a presence. He looked at Clem with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious and somehow more unnerving than anger would have been. "Evening, Clem," Milton said. "Ralston." Clem's grin went sour. The 2 men with him shifted slightly. "Miss Sawyer's going to dinner," Milton said. "You have a good night." There was a moment, one of those moments in which a situation could go several ways and hangs in the balance like a coin spinning in the air, and then Clem stepped aside with a muttered curse and the 3 of them moved off down the street. Irene let out a slow breath. "I had that in hand." "I know you did," Milton said, falling into step beside her. "I was in the vicinity." They walked in silence for a moment. The evening sky above the flat plains was turning extraordinary shades of amber and rose, the kind of sunset that made the whole raw, dusty town look briefly beautiful. "Do you make a habit of being in the vicinity?" she asked. "This is the only road between the livery and the boarding house," he said reasonably. "It'd be a longer walk to avoid it." She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that might have been a smile. "Are you eating at Dora's tonight?" she asked. "I do most nights." He glanced at her. "I'm a terrible cook." Despite everything, she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Missouri, and it surprised her with how much it felt like relief. After that, it became a natural thing. Not planned, not discussed, just natural in the way that some things become when 2 people are moving in the same direction. Milton would often be leaving the livery at about the same time Irene was done with her lesson preparation, and they would walk to Dora's together, and they would sit at the same end of the long dining table, and they would talk. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but piece by piece as the light changes. He had grown up on a ranch outside of San Antonio, the older of 2 brothers. His father had been a rancher, and his mother had been a woman of considerable education and strong opinions, which she had apparently passed on to Milton in full measure. He had come to Dustcreek 4 years ago with the money he had saved from working on other men's ranches and a plan to establish his own livery, because he understood horses in a way that was almost intuitive, and because a livery in a growing town was a more stable business than ranching. "You gave up ranching for stability?" she asked one evening, over plates of Dora Finch's excellent beef stew. "My father lost the ranch when I was 17, Milton said. Drought and debt and a banker in San Antonio who had no interest in giving an extension. I watched my father spend 30 years building something and lose it in a season." He said it without bitterness but with a careful precision, the way someone talks about something that has left a mark. "I decided I wanted to build something that couldn't be taken from me as easily." "Is a livery harder to take?" she asked. "It's less dependent on rain," he said. She understood that perfectly. Her family's farm in Missouri had also been a casualty of weather and debt, though in their case it had been a combination of 3 bad winters in a row and her father's increasingly poor health. She told him this, more than she had intended to tell him, sitting in the amber lamplight of Dora's dining room while the other boarders drifted away to their rooms. She told him about her mother who had died when Irene was 12, and about her father who had sold the farm the previous autumn and moved in with her married sister in Kansas City. She told him about the letter from Gerald Holt and the long stagecoach journey and the tumbleweed. Milton listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without interruption. When she finished, he said, "That tumbleweed was a warning." "It was," she agreed. "Doesn't seem like you're very good at taking warnings." "That's probably true." He smiled at her then, fully, not the half-contained thing at the corner of his mouth that she had already catalogued, but a real smile, and she felt the warmth of it in her chest like the stove had been stoked higher. Spring deepened into summer in Dustcreek, and the days grew long and bright and relentlessly hot. Irene's schoolroom was like an oven by mid-afternoon, and she took to moving the afternoon lessons outside under the 2 large cottonwood trees that grew along the eastern side of the schoolhouse. The children were happier for it, and she found that lessons conducted outdoors, where the children could hear the wind and see the hawks circling above the plain, had a different quality to them, more alive and less constrained. Tom Ralston brought a king snake to school in late May, which caused considerable excitement. Irene handled the situation by incorporating it into a lesson about the natural history of Texas, which impressed even the oldest children and earned her a level of respect that no amount of blackboard arithmetic could have managed. Tom stopped her after school that day, grinning with the particular gap-toothed grin of a 9-year-old who has gotten away with something. "You weren't scared of it," he said. "No," she agreed. "Were you expecting me to be? Most ladies would have screamed." "I'm not most ladies," she said, which was a thing she had been saying to herself since she was about 10 years old and had decided she intended to mean it. Tom looked at her with that direct, appraising gaze that was so much like his uncle's. "My uncle said you were brave," he said, in the tone of someone reporting an important fact. She kept her expression calm. "Did he?" "He said it to Bobby. He didn't know I was listening." Tom seemed to feel that this confession was a fair trade. Then he picked up his school bag and ran off toward home, leaving Irene standing under the cottonwood with a warm flush climbing her throat that she attributed entirely to the summer heat. She did not bring it up to Milton. But that evening on their walk to Dora's, when he asked her how school had gone, she told him about the snake with some amusement, and he laughed, and it was a good laugh, unguarded and genuine, and it made the evening light look warmer than it had a moment before. "Tom thinks you walk on water," he said. "Tom thinks snakes are an acceptable school supply," she replied. "He's not entirely wrong." They had reached the boarding house, but neither of them immediately went inside. The evening was still warm, and the first stars were coming out over the plains, sharp and brilliant in the clear Texas sky. They stood on the porch for a while, talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when a conversation has passed the point of needing a purpose. It was on that porch that Milton told her about the land he had been saving to buy, 80 acres north of town along the creek, good grass and reliable water. He wanted to run a small breeding operation alongside the livery, quarter horses, the kind that could work cattle all day and still have something left in them at the end of it. He had nearly enough money saved. Another year, maybe 2. "That sounds like everything you planned when you came here," she said. "Most of it," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that she heard but chose not to press on, not yet, not standing in the warm dark with the stars above the plains and the uncertain territory of what they were to each other still unmarked. June brought the first real event of Dustcreek's social calendar, a barn dance at the Fuller Ranch 3 miles south of town to celebrate the completion of the Fullers' new barn. The whole town attended, which in a town of Dustcreek's size meant perhaps 60 or 70 people, and there was a fiddle player and a banjo player, and a man with an accordion who occasionally played something that bore no resemblance to the rhythm everyone else was playing, but who played it with such enthusiasm that no one said anything. Irene went with Dora Finch, who had taken on something of a supervisory role in Irene's social life that Irene found more comforting than smothering. She wore her best dress, a deep green cotton with white collar and cuffs that she had brought from Missouri and had quietly mended and pressed as carefully as possible, and Dora told her she looked lovely, and Irene believed her, because Dora was not a woman who said things she did not mean. Milton was already there when they arrived, standing near the barn door with his brother Bobby, a shorter, stockier version of himself with a wider face and a more immediately obvious warmth about him. Bobby Ralston greeted Irene with a handshake and the immediate announcement that Tom had talked about her nearly every evening for the past 2 months, which made Irene laugh and made Milton direct a look at his brother that Bobby received with cheerful indifference. There was dancing, enthusiastic if not always technically accomplished, and food that the women of the town had contributed in quantities that suggested competitive generosity, and the kind of collective ease that happens when people who work hard and live in proximity gather for the specific purpose of not working. Irene danced with Arthur Belk, who was surprisingly light on his feet, and with Bobby Ralston, who was not, and with a rancher named Sam Fuller, who was the host and who danced with every woman present out of hospitality. She was sitting out a reel, watching the dancers and eating a piece of very good dried peach pie, when Milton came to sit beside her. "You dance well," he said. "I was made to take lessons when I was 12, she said. "It was the one concession my father made to elegance before the money ran out entirely." She paused. "He thought every girl should know how to dance. He was not wrong." "Would you dance with me?" he asked. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that directness, that honest, uncomplicated attention, and she felt suddenly as if the whole noisy barn had receded slightly. "Yes," she said. The fiddle player had moved into something slower, a waltz of a kind, though with a distinctly Texas quality to it that a Viennese musician would have found puzzling. Milton offered his hand and she took it, and they moved into the space among the other dancers. He danced well, which did not entirely surprise her. He moved with the same economy and assurance that he brought to everything else. She was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back and the steadiness of his other hand in hers, and she was aware of the small distance between them that was proper and appropriate and that she found herself very conscious of. "You're going to make this town something good," he said quietly, meant only for her. "I'm going to try," she said. "You already have. Tom reads to himself now at night. Bobby told me. He never did that before." She felt a pure, uncomplicated pride at that, the kind that has nothing to do with vanity. "He's a clever boy. He just needed someone to take him seriously." "He's not the only one who needed that," Milton said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made her look up at him, and she found him already looking at her. And for a long moment they looked at each other while the music played and the lanterns swung, and the summer evening moved around them. And something passed between them that had been building since a tumbleweed had rolled across a dusty street in April, wordless and clear and entirely understood by both of them. He brought her home to the schoolhouse that night, walking beside her in the dark under the enormous Texas stars. They stood at the schoolhouse door, and she thought he might kiss her, and she thought she would let him, but he didn't, only stood for a moment with a look on his face that was both careful and warm, and said, "Good night, Irene." It was the first time he had used her given name. "Good night, Milton," she said, and went inside and stood in the dark of her small room for a long time with her hands pressed flat against her own chest, feeling her heart. The summer continued, golden and hot, and full of small accumulating moments between them. Books they both had read and discussed with the pleasure of people who have not often had someone to discuss books with. The particular quality of light on the plain in the late afternoon that they both noticed independently, and then found they had the same word for, not beautiful but honest, a light that showed things as they were. His quiet pride in his horses, the way he talked about them not as possessions but as collaborators. Her growing attachment to her students and to the town, the sense that she was not just passing through a place but beginning to belong to it. In July, there was a problem with Clem Holt. It began with a letter, or rather with the absence of a letter. Irene had been expecting a small sum of money from her father, forwarded through her sister in Kansas City, money she had lent him before leaving Missouri and which he had promised to repay when he could. The money arrived, but the letter accompanying it had been opened and resealed poorly, and $20 were missing from the envelope. Arthur Belk handled the mail. He also, it turned out, owed a significant sum to Clem Holt, who had been pressing him for payment. When Irene brought the matter to Arthur quietly and without accusation, he broke down almost immediately and confessed that Clem had pressured him into taking money from a handful of incoming letters over the past several months. This was a federal matter. Mail tampering was a serious offense, and Irene knew it. She went to see the county sheriff, a man named Harlan Webb who was based in the larger town of Caraway 12 miles east and who visited Dustcreek twice a month. Milton came with her. Not because she asked him to, but because he found out from Dora, who had heard from Bobby's wife, who had heard from Tom, who had sharp ears and a habit of being present when important conversations occurred. He arrived at the schoolhouse the morning she was planning to ride to Caraway and said simply, "I'll take you." "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him and thought about arguing and decided it was not worth arguing because she was glad he was there, and pretending otherwise would have been a waste of both their time. They rode to Caraway on 2 horses from the livery, side by side on a road that cut through the flat grassland with the sky enormous and blue above them. They talked, and also were comfortably silent in the way that takes some people years to achieve. She told him she was nervous, not about the meeting with the sheriff but about the consequences for Arthur Belk, who was a weak man but not a bad one, who had been preyed upon by someone stronger and crueler. "The law has to handle it," Milton said. "But Harlan Webb is a fair man. He'll take circumstances into account." Sheriff Webb was indeed a fair man, methodical and thorough, who listened to Irene's account carefully, asked precise questions, and promised to investigate. The result, 2 weeks later, was that Clem Holt was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit mail fraud, a charge serious enough to result in his removal from Dustcreek pending trial in the county seat. Arthur Belk cooperated fully and received a lesser consequence, a significant fine and a period of supervised conduct, which Irene felt was proportionate, and which the rest of the town seemed to feel as well. The silver spur passed to a distant cousin of the late Gerald Holt, a woman from Dallas named Frances Hooper, who arrived in August and immediately set about transforming it from a disreputable establishment into a reasonably respectable saloon and dining room, which improved the atmosphere of the town considerably. With Clem Holt gone, a tension that Irene had not even fully registered until it lifted seemed to ease from her shoulders. She slept better. She felt safer on her evening walks. The tight, watchful quality that had been in her since that first day in Dustcreek relaxed into something more open, and in that openness, the thing between her and Milton Ralston grew. He began walking her home from Dora's more deliberately, not just when their paths coincided but seeking it out. He brought her a book he had finished, Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which had been published 2 years prior, and which he thought she would appreciate both because of the obvious name overlap and because it was simply excellent. She read it in 2 days and returned it with 3 pages of notes she had made on loose paper because she couldn't stop herself. And he read her notes with the same serious attention he brought to everything, and then they talked about it for nearly an hour on the schoolhouse steps in the last heat of August. He asked her to ride out with him one Saturday to see the land along the creek. It was a golden morning in late August, the air still carrying a hint of night cool, the grassland rippling in a light breeze. The land he showed her was exactly as he had described it, green along the water, open and broad, with a view of the distant hills to the northwest that gave the landscape scale and depth. They tied the horses to a willow and walked along the creek bank, and he pointed out where he intended to build the pastures, where the barn would go, where the main well should be sunk. Irene listened and watched his face as he talked about it, the concentrated, quiet passion of someone speaking about a thing they have carried in their imagination for years, polishing it smooth. She thought about what it would look like, what it would feel like to stand in this exact place when the barn was built, and the horses were in the pasture, and the land was alive with the work of daily life. She thought about it with a specific quality of longing that she recognized as no longer being entirely abstract. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant the land and also meant something more, and he turned and looked at her and she thought he knew exactly what she meant. "Irene," he said. "Milton," she said. They stood on the creek bank in the morning light with the water moving beside them and the grassland stretching out in every direction, and he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a careful, deliberate touch that was the most tender thing she had felt in years, and she put her hand over his and held it there for a moment. "I think I've been in love with you since you told Clem Holt to move aside on the street," she said, because she had decided that honesty was easier than anything else, and also because she was watching his face and she knew what was there, and it seemed like a waste to wait any longer. He laughed, soft and low. "I think I've been in love with you since you took Tom's snake and made it into a lesson," he said. She shook her head, smiling. "That was months after." "I know," he said. "I was being careful. Were you?" "You'd come a long way with a plan that didn't work out," he said, all seriousness now beneath the warmth. "I wanted to make sure you were staying because you wanted to stay, not because you were building something good here and didn't have the resources to leave yet. I needed to know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment, understanding that this was not caution born of hesitation, but of respect, of a genuine concern that her choice be genuinely hers. "I am staying," she said. "I am staying because this is mine now, the school and the town and the people." She paused. "And because of you, that last part isn't small." He drew her forward and kissed her, there on the creek bank with the willows moving and the horses watching with patient equine indifference, and it was unhurried and thorough and honest, like everything else about him. And she thought, yes, this is exactly right, and felt the last piece of something fall into place inside her the way a window shutter fits its latch when the wind stops. They rode back to town in the late morning, holding hands when the horses walked close enough to allow it, and talked easily all the way, and also lapsed into comfortable silences that felt like a different kind of talking. The autumn was extraordinary. The school term began again, with 22 children now, 4 more than the previous term as new families arrived with the continuing growth of the town. Irene hired a young woman named Clara Peters as a part-time assistant, because 22 children of varying ages and abilities was more than one person could adequately serve alone, and Clara turned out to be a remarkably quick learner with a particular gift for the youngest children. Milton bought the land along the creek in September. He came to tell Irene the evening of the day the papers were signed, arriving at the schoolhouse with a light in his face that she had not quite seen before, a kind of clean, uncomplicated joy. She had a pot of coffee on the small stove and 2 cups, as if she had known he was coming, though she hadn't. "It's mine," he said, sitting across from her at the small table and wrapping both hands around the coffee cup. "It's yours," she agreed. "I want to start building before the cold sets in, get the foundation of the house laid at least." She watched him over her cup. "House," she said, "not just barn and pastures." He met her eyes. "House," he confirmed, and the word carried everything it needed to carry between 2 people who had been honest with each other for long enough to understand exactly what was said and what was meant. She set down her cup. "Milton, are you asking me something?" He was quiet for one moment, and she could see him assembling the words carefully, the way he did things, without rush and without waste. Then he reached into his vest pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a ring, thin silver with a small turquoise stone, simple and beautiful, the kind of thing that a man finds in a jewelry case in a general store and holds in his palm for a moment and knows with absolute certainty is right. "I am asking you," he said. "Irene, I have been in love with you since you turned a snake into a lesson, and I will be in love with you until there isn't any more of me to be in love with anything. I want to build that house on the creek with you. I want to wake up on that land with you. I want to be the person who walks beside you for the rest of your life." He paused. "I would like very much for you to be my wife if you're willing." She looked at the ring and then at him and felt something she could not quite name, something like sunlight through water, bright and shifting and entirely filling the space it moved through. "Yes," she said. "I am willing. I'm very willing." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at the turquoise against her skin, blue-green as the creek in summer, and then she looked at him and laughed with the fullness of it, the real, unguarded laugh that had begun on that first evening walk and had been growing ever since. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her with the same quality of care he had in everything, thorough and real. And they stood in the small room of the schoolhouse in the lamplight with the Texas night outside, and the ring on her finger and the future ahead of them, specific and bright. The news spread through Dustcreek in approximately 4 hours, which was about 3 hours and 50 minutes longer than Milton had predicted. Tom was one of the first to find out, being at the livery when his uncle arrived back from the schoolhouse, and his reaction was to punch the air with his small fist and say, "I knew it," with a ferocity that suggested he had in fact been rooting for this outcome for quite some time. Bobby Ralston arrived within the hour, pulling Irene into a bear hug that left her slightly short of breath, and then gripping his brother's shoulder with a wordless emotion that said everything a longer speech would have. Dora Finch said, "Well, of course," as if the entire thing had been entirely predictable and entirely satisfactory, and then fed everyone pie. They were married in November, in the still-being-finished church on the edge of town, on a clear cold day with the plains frost-white around them, and the sky a deep clear blue above. Irene wore a dress that she had made herself over the previous 6 weeks, cream-colored wool with small pearl buttons down the front and cuffs she had embroidered with a pattern of leaves, because she had needed something to do with her hands during the evenings when she was very happy, and it made her feel almost unbearably awake. Bobby stood up with Milton. Clara Peters stood up with Irene. Tom sat in the front row beside his father Bobby and his mother me, and spent the entire ceremony grinning with the gap-toothed openness of someone who has been entirely right about something important. The Reverend, a young man named Thomas Early who had arrived in Dustcreek only 6 weeks before, conducted the ceremony with genuine warmth, though he stumbled slightly over his words at one point and then recovered and seemed surprised by his own emotion, which Irene found rather sweet. When Milton said, "I do," he was looking directly at her, and his voice was steady and certain and warm, and she thought she would remember the quality of his voice at that exact moment for the rest of her life. When she said, "I do," she meant it with every particular part of herself. He kissed her in the unfinished church with the smell of fresh timber around them, and the people of Dustcreek cheering. And it was, she thought, exactly the kind of wedding she would have designed if anyone had asked her. Not grand or elaborate, but entirely honest and entirely joyful and entirely theirs. The reception was held in the school, which was the largest indoor space the town had, and it went on long into the night with dancing and Dora's cooking and considerable amounts of the respectable beverages that Francis Hooper had provided from the newly improved Silver Spur. Several speeches were made, Bobby's being the longest and most effusive and also the most earnest, ending with a quote from Longfellow that he confessed Milton had suggested to him, which made the whole room laugh and made Irene look at her husband with an expression that she knew was entirely readable and did not care. They spent their wedding night at the Caraway Hotel, which was the finest establishment within a day's ride, and which had a room with actual wallpaper and a real porcelain bathtub, both of which Irene considered luxuries of the most magnificent kind. They talked until nearly 2 in the morning, sitting up in the lamplight with the comfortable ease of two people who have always found talking to each other the best use of available time. And then the talking stopped, and the night went on. And in the morning they had coffee and eggs in the hotel dining room, and rode home to Dustcreek as husband and wife under a sky that was bright and cold and absolutely clear. They spent the winter in Irene's rooms at the schoolhouse, which was not ideal but was adequate, while Milton worked on the foundation of the house along the creek on every Saturday and Sunday that weather permitted, and sometimes on weekday evenings when the days were long enough. Bobby and Sam Fuller and two other men from town helped with the heavy work, and Irene brought food out to them on the work days, large pots of stew and cornbread and coffee, feeding them all at a makeshift table of planks on sawhorses, sitting in the cold sunshine, and listening to the men argue cheerfully about the best way to cut dovetail joints. She continued to teach through the winter, because the school needed her and because she loved it, the two not being in any tension with each other. Milton never suggested she should stop, never implied that her work was something to be set aside now that she had a husband. He asked about her students by name, remembered details she had told him about them, asked follow-up questions at dinner. This, she had come to understand, was simply how he loved, attentively and consistently, the way he tended his horses or planned his land, with care that was not performative but habitual, built into the structure of how he moved through the world. In late January, on a gray Sunday afternoon with the wind coming hard off the plain and the temperature too low for any outdoor work, they were sitting by the schoolhouse stove reading when Irene looked up from her book and said, "I think I'm expecting." Milton lowered his book. He looked at her for a moment with a stillness that she had learned to read as the outward sign of a strong, inward feeling. Then he set the book down entirely and came to sit beside her and took both her hands in his. "How do you feel?" he asked, which was his first question and which she found exactly right. "Good," she said. "Nervous, good," she paused. "Mostly good." He brought her hands up and pressed his lips against them, not a performative gesture but a private one, a thing done because he felt it and not because anyone was watching. "We're going to be all right," he said. "We are," she agreed, because she believed it, which was itself something remarkable to believe without certainty but with full conviction. She went to see the town doctor, a steady-handed man named Charles Holt, no relation to the unpleasant Clem, who confirmed what she already knew and gave her a great deal of sensible advice, and also a small bottle of iron tonic that tasted terrible, and which she took every morning with grimly cheerful determination. Tom, when he found out, presented her with a carefully folded drawing he had made of a horse, which he said was for the baby. "So they know what horses look like when they're little," he explained, with the solemn generosity of a 9-year-old. Irene kept the drawing pinned inside the cover of her lesson book. Spring came again, and with it the house. It went up fast once the walls began, Milton having planned it so thoroughly over the winter that every piece of timber and every keg of nails was accounted for in advance. It was not a large house by any standard, 4 rooms with a covered porch along the front, good solid construction of the kind that was meant to last decades rather than just years. The kitchen had a large iron stove that Milton had ordered from the catalog in September, and that arrived in February and had been stored in the livery ever since, waiting for its room to be built around it. There was a bedroom with good southern exposure for warmth, a second bedroom that was smaller and would serve as the nursery, a main room with a stone fireplace, and the kitchen. Irene walked through it for the first time on a May afternoon with the walls newly plastered, and the floors newly laid and the whole thing smelling of wood and fresh plaster and the creek willows coming through the open windows. She walked from room to room and stood in each one and felt the solidity of it, the reality of it, the way it was exactly what she had believed in without being able to fully see. "Well?" Milton asked, watching her from the doorway of the main room. She turned and looked at him across the empty room, the afternoon light falling through the windows, and making everything warm and clear. "This is ours," she said, with a wonder that was not entirely surprised but that was entirely genuine. "This is ours," he confirmed. They moved in the following week, which meant 3 days of carrying things from the schoolhouse to a wagon and from the wagon into the house, with Bobby and me helping, and Tom in charge of the smaller items, a responsibility he took with great seriousness and moderate organizational skill. Dora Finch arrived on the 3rd day with a crate of jars of preserved food and a quilt she had made as a housewarming gift, and she stood in the kitchen and looked around with an expression that managed to convey both approval and affection simultaneously. That evening, their first evening in the house, Irene stood on the porch while Milton made coffee inside, and looked out at the creek and the grassland going golden in the evening sun, and listened to the water and the birds and the wind in the willows, and felt a completeness that she had worked toward for so long it had sometimes seemed like a thing other people experienced. She was home. Not in the way she had been home in Missouri, borrowed from a childhood that had ended. This was her home, built with her own effort and the effort of someone who loved her, on land that was theirs, in a life that was genuinely hers. Milton came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her, and they watched the evening come in together, and neither of them felt any need to say anything about it because they both already knew. The baby came in September, a boy, arriving in the manner of babies everywhere, which is to say entirely on his own schedule, and with considerable drama, on a Tuesday morning when the air smelled of autumn and the willows along the creek were going gold. The doctor was present, and Ralston was there to help, and Milton was outside the bedroom door in a state of barely controlled tension that Bobby, who had arrived within 20 minutes of being sent for, was unable to fully conceal his amusement at. When Charles Holt opened the bedroom door and told Milton he had a son, the look on Milton's face was one that Irene, seeing it from the bed where she lay exhausted and entirely at peace, would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not the face of a man performing a feeling for an audience, but of a man experiencing something so large that he had momentarily lost control of his expression. He came and sat beside her, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful, thorough attention he brought to everything, and looked down at the small face, and then up at her, and there were no adequate words for any of it, but neither of them needed any. "James," Irene said. They had agreed on the name months before, after her grandfather, and also because it was a good solid name that a person could carry through a life of any shape. "James," Milton said, and the way he said it, quiet and certain, made it feel like a promise. James Milton Ralston arrived in the world with dark hair like his father's and Irene's particular habit of looking at things with total concentration, which made him seem, even in his first days, as if he were taking everything seriously and filing it away for later. Tom was permitted to meet him on the 2nd day. He stood beside the cradle and looked at his cousin with a grave attentiveness and then said, "He's very small," in the tone of someone making an objective scientific observation. "He'll get bigger," Milton assured him. "Will he like horses?" Tom asked. "Probably," Irene said. Tom considered this. "Good," he said, with the satisfaction of a problem resolved. The first year of James's life was the year the quarter-horse operation properly began. Milton had purchased his first breeding pair the previous spring, a stallion he called Cedar for his color, and a mare he called Patience for reasons that became obvious to anyone who spent time around her, who was technically gentle but who had a very particular way of expressing her opinions about things she did not find acceptable. By the autumn, they had their first foal, a leggy, curious colt that Milton spent a great deal of time just watching, with the same expression he wore when he was thinking through something important. Irene continued to teach. This had required some logistics, namely, that me would come to the house on Creek Road on mornings when James was very young, and then later that James himself would come to the school, which turned out to be an excellent arrangement, because the older children competed quietly, but intensely for the privilege of keeping him entertained during the lesson periods. And it gave them all a practical education in responsibility that no textbook could have replicated. Clara Peters took over Irene's youngest age class permanently, having grown into a fully capable teacher in her own right. Irene taught the older children and managed the overall running of the school, and Arthur Belk, who had served out his consequences and emerged from them genuinely chastened and somewhat improved, was now the school's main supporter on the town council and advocated for their budget with a diligence that Irene suspected was at least partly motivated by a desire to make amends. Dustcreek itself was growing. By 1880, there were over 200 people in the town and surrounding area. The church had been finished. There was a doctor's surgery with an actual dedicated surgery room. Francis Hooper had expanded the Silver Spur into a proper dining establishment with rooms, and it was the kind of place that a traveler could stop and feel they had found something real rather than just something functional. There was a new schoolhouse being built, larger than the current one, on a plot that the town council had designated for the purpose, and it would have 4 rooms instead of 1, and Irene had been asked to oversee its design with the contractor, which she did with a meticulous attention to natural light and ventilation that the contractor initially thought was fussy and eventually came to agree was simply right. In the spring of 1881, when James was a year and a half and beginning to navigate the world with the somewhat alarming physical confidence of a toddler who has no established sense of risk, Irene sat on the porch on a late afternoon and watched Milton work with Cedar in the near pasture. He was working the stallion on a long rein. A quiet, patient process that he had explained to her once was about establishing trust before asking anything difficult, about letting the horse know through consistency and steadiness that the person on the other end of the line was worth following. She had thought, when he told her that it was probably how he did everything. James was sitting beside her on the porch, deeply occupied with attempting to pick up a grasshopper that kept jumping out of his reach, periodically announcing his feelings about this development in the emphatic, purely emotional language of 18-month-olds. She watched him and then watched Milton in the pasture, the evening light making everything gold and specific, the sound of the creek below the willows and the horses in the pasture, and the grasshopper escaping again with a short leap. She felt, with a depth and a certainty she had no need to examine, the exact quality of happiness that she had crossed a great deal of difficult ground to reach. Not perfect in the sense of being without difficulty or uncertainty, but real and hers, and built of choices she had made and work she had done and love that had been offered to her with a straightforwardness that had made it possible to receive it fully. Milton finished with Cedar and came up to the pasture fence, catching sight of her on the porch and raising his hand. She raised hers. James looked up from the grasshopper to see what his mother was waving at, spotted his father, and immediately lost all interest in the grasshopper in favor of standing up and waving both arms with the total commitment of a person whose feelings are never ambiguous. Milton laughed and vaulted the pasture fence and came across the yard, and James ran to him at the particular velocity of a toddler who has not yet fully reconciled the speed of his intentions with the capability of his legs, and Milton caught him and swung him up, and James shrieked with the uncontrollable delight of it. Irene watched them, her husband and her son, in the evening light of their property along the creek, and there was no adequate word for what she felt, only the thing itself, enormous and simple and entirely sufficient. Milton carried James up onto the porch and sat in the other chair. James settled in his lap, already turning his attention back to the grasshopper question from this new elevated vantage point. Milton looked at Irene with a smile that was easy and warm and entirely his, the smile that was not performed for anyone but that simply existed because she was there and he was glad of it. "Good day," he asked. "Good day," she said. "There's a letter from your father in town." Dora was holding it. "I'll get it tomorrow. He says he's thinking of coming to visit," Milton said. She turned to look at him. You already picked it up. I thought you'd want to know." He lifted a hand in a mild gesture of admission. She shook her head and then smiled. "I would like him to see this," she said, "meaning all of it. The house and the land and the horses in the pasture and the town 3 miles east and the life that had been assembled piece by piece since a Tuesday morning in April when a tumbleweed rolled into her path and she refused to be warned off." "Then we'll have him come," Milton said simply. Her father arrived in July, a gray-haired man with her own eyes and a slight frailty to him that she had known intellectually, but that was more present in the flesh than she had fully prepared herself for. He had been ill the previous winter and had recovered but not entirely, and she felt the particular ache of that understanding, the adjustment a person makes when they see a parent beginning to diminish. But he was himself, curious and warm, and given to long observations about things he found interesting, which apparently included everything about Dustcreek and everything about Milton Ralston. He spent 3 days asking Milton questions about the horses and the land and the livery business, with the focused interest of someone who has spent a life on a farm and retains a genuine curiosity about all things that grow and are tended. Milton answered him with patience and pleasure, and Irene sat on the porch on the second evening listening to them talk in the kitchen, and thought that this was also something she had not known to hope for specifically, but was glad of now that it was real. Her father held James on his knee for long periods of time, with a quiet contentment that she found difficult to look at without her throat going tight, because she could see in it both the grandfather and the man who had tried his best with what he had, and had not always succeeded, but had loved his children without question, and she had reached a point in her life where she could hold those two things together without one negating the other. On his last evening they sat on the porch and watched the sunset over the plain, and her father said, "You built something real, Irene." "Yes," she said. "Your mother would have loved this." He looked out at the land. "She would have loved him too, I think." "I think so too," she said. He left on a Saturday morning, the stagecoach taking him back toward Kansas City, and she watched it until it was a small shape on the long road east, and then she felt Milton beside her and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood there until the coach was gone. "He should come again," Milton said. "He will," she said. She intended to make certain of it. The autumn of 1881 brought a dry spell that worried the ranchers in the area, the kind of thing that everyone who farmed or ranched in Texas lived with the awareness of, the fragility of dependence on rain. Milton's land along the creek was less affected than the open range, the water in the creek staying adequate through even dry periods, but the grass on the pastures was stressed, and he supplemented the horses' feed from the stores he kept in the barn. Irene watched him make these adjustments with the quiet efficiency of someone who had thought through contingencies before they became necessary, and she thought of his father's ranch and the drought that had taken it, and she understood the calculations he carried in him. "We're all right," she said to him one evening, seeing the quality of thought on his face. He looked at her. "We are," he said. "The creek holds, and I've got the reserves." "You planned for it." "My father didn't have a choice about planning," he said. "I did." The dry spell broke in October with 3 days of steady rain that turned the plains green again and sent the creek running fast and clear and made the horses restless with energy. Tom came out on the Sunday after the rain broke, now 11 years old and increasingly serious about learning to work with horses, and Milton spent the afternoon teaching him the beginning of what he had taught himself over years: how to read an animal's attention, how to approach and step back, how to make patience into communication. Irene watched from the pasture fence with James on her hip, James watching with the total focused attention he brought to his father's world, and she thought about the chain of things, how knowledge passes from one person to another, generation to generation, and how a livery on the south end of a growing Texas town was also a place where something was being passed along that was more than horse management. Life in Dustcreek continued to layer itself, season upon season. The new schoolhouse opened in the spring of 1882, 4 rooms and large windows, and a proper teacher's cottage beside it that Irene accepted the key to with an emotion she managed to keep dignified. She moved her books and her materials from the old building and arranged her new classroom with the same careful attention she had given to the first dusty schoolhouse 3 years before, though now she knew these students and these windows and this light, and the arranging felt like coming home rather than beginning. Francis Hooper's establishment had grown into the genuine social center of Dustcreek, hosting visiting performers once or twice a year and regular weekly dances that had become a town institution. Irene and Milton attended most of them, and they still danced together with the particular ease of people who had been dancing together long enough to stop thinking about it, the conversation between their bodies fluent and natural. In the winter of 1882, Irene discovered she was expecting again. This time there was no nervousness in her announcement, only a warm certainty. "James will be a brother," she told Milton over breakfast on a January morning, the stove going and the frost on the window panes and James eating cornmeal mush with dedicated inefficiency. Milton looked up from his coffee and smiled slowly. "He'll be excellent at it," he said. "He already bosses the foals." She laughed. "He does." This baby was born in August, coming somewhat faster and with less drama than James had, which Charles Holt said was usually the way with second children. She was a girl with dark hair and her mother's eyes, and they named her Clara Me, Clara for Irene's capable teaching assistant and Me for Bobby's wife, who had been a steady and generous presence in their lives since the beginning. James, at nearly 3, was solemn and very serious about his sister for approximately 2 hours before deciding that she was interesting, but that horses were still more immediately compelling and returning to his main occupation. He was brought back to meet her properly at intervals throughout her first days, and his relationship with her had the particular quality that would define it for years, genuinely affectionate but fundamentally pragmatic, as if he had decided that she was a person worth his time, and he was organizing the logistics of that accordingly. Milton held his daughter with the same care with which he had held his son, and the look on his face when he held Clara was exactly what it had been when he held James, that unguarded, enormous feeling, the thing that had no performance in it because it required none. Tom, now 13 and thoroughly at home in the house along the creek, arrived to meet the baby with a carefully selected gift, a small carving of a horse that he had made himself over the previous month, having taught himself to whittle with a focus that demonstrated his uncle's particular quality of quietly determined persistence. It was a good carving, genuinely recognizable as a horse, and done with a care that showed in the smooth finish. Irene kept it on the windowsill of the nursery, where the afternoon light came through and fell across it, and where it stayed for years. The years that followed had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary freight of living, the dry seasons and the hard winters and the small losses and the larger ones, but genuinely good in the way that is built rather than happened upon. The quarter horse operation grew until Milton had a steady reputation in the county for the quality of his animals, ranchers coming from as far as 50 miles to buy from him. The livery in town continued to run, managed now with the help of a young man named Frank who had appeared in Dustcreek at 17 with nothing but skill and determination, and who Milton had recognized and hired and trained, and who was, by 20, as reliable as any man Milton knew. The school grew with the town, and Irene grew with it, not just as a teacher but as someone who understood what a school in a small western town could mean, not only for the children who came through it but for the community that gathered around it. She began writing letters to the State Education Board in Austin about resources and curriculum, receiving responses that were initially dismissive and eventually, through the persistence she had been practicing since she was 10 years old, became substantive. James started school, of course, being taught by Clara Peters, while his mother taught the older children in a room across the hall, an arrangement that suited both of them. He had inherited Irene's ability with words and Milton's particular quality of attention, and he read everything he could find and asked questions about what he read that were sometimes inconvenient and always interesting. Clara Mee, when her time came, took to school the way she took to everything else in her life, at full velocity and with absolute confidence that it would yield to her, which it generally did. Bobby Ralston expanded his cattle operation in 1884 and bought the neighboring property, making the Ralston holdings along that section of the creek considerable. There were Sunday dinners that gathered both families, Bobby and me and Tom and his younger sister Annie at the long table in the house along the creek, plates passed and stories told, and the particular warmth of people who have chosen to be family to each other, alongside the fact of being family by blood or marriage. One evening in the summer of 1885, when James was 4 and Clara Mee was nearly 3, and the house along the creek had acquired the specific comfortable character of a house lived in by people who loved the living of it, Irene and Milton were sitting on the porch as they had sat on it hundreds of times, the evening coming in soft and warm and the creek running below the willows. "Do you remember the tumbleweed?" she asked him, apropos of nothing except the quality of her own contentment which sometimes made her want to trace its origins. He turned to look at her. "The one that rolled at you when you stepped off the stagecoach. Tom told you that. Tom tells me everything eventually." He smiled. "What about it?" "I was thinking about warnings," she said, "about the things that look like bad omens and turn out to be just the dust of the road." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was a good day the day you arrived." "It was a terrible day," she corrected, amused. "For you, yes. For me, standing outside the general store, it was a very good day." She looked at him. This man she had built her life beside, whose steady, honest love had been the foundation on which everything else had been possible, and she felt the weight and the fullness of it. The years and the children and the house and the land and the work and the 10,000 evenings on this porch. "I am so glad I didn't take the warning," she said. He reached across and took her hand. "I am too," he said. From the kitchen came the sound of James explaining something to his sister with considerable force, and Clara Mee's response, which was equally forceful and entirely confident, and then both of them laughing at something that only they understood, the private language of children who are close in age and close in the way that comes from being entirely at home with each other. Milton looked toward the kitchen and then back at Irene. "Chaos," he said affectionately. "Yes," she said, holding his hand in the evening warmth. "Beautiful chaos." The horses were in the pasture, Cedar and Patience and their offspring, moving in the easy way of animals that are well cared for and at peace. The creek ran steady below the willows, the sound of it a constant under everything else, patient and unhurried. The stars were beginning to come out over the plain, sharp and brilliant as they always were out here, away from the light of town. Irene leaned her head against Milton's shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him, the particular way he settled when she did this, not tense or surprised but simply present, as if he had always known this was where she would be. "Bobby said Tom is thinking about going to study law," she said. "He told me," Milton said. "Austin maybe, there's a decent program." "He'll do it," she said. "He's exactly stubborn enough. That's a family trait." "On your side," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, unhurried. "On yours too, if I remember correctly." She smiled and did not argue because she couldn't. The evening deepened into full dark, and the children came out eventually, James still making his case for something and Clara Mee still holding her position, and they settled on the porch steps and looked at the stars, and James asked which ones had names, and Irene pointed out Orion and the Pleiades and the Great Dipper, and Milton added the ones she didn't know offhand. And Clara Mee fell asleep leaning against her father's leg, with the absolute certainty of a small person, who has never had reason to doubt the solidity of the person they are leaning on. Milton carried her inside, and Irene brought James, and they put them both to bed in the room with the carving Tom had made still on the windowsill, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at their children in the dark. Then they went back to the porch, because the night was too good to be inside, and they sat together in the dark with the creek and the horses and the stars. There were more years ahead of them, years that would bring the changes that years always bring. Tom going to Austin and coming back a lawyer with a practice in Caraway, James growing into a young man with his father's hands and his mother's words, Clara me growing into a person of formidable competence and occasional terrifying certainty, Bobby and me's family growing alongside theirs. The school in Dustcreek becoming something that Irene had built across 15 years into a thing she was proud of in the deep, quiet way of work that matters. There would be hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary difficulties of living on a young and unfinished frontier. There would be loss too, because no life is without it, and they would hold each other through those losses with the same steadiness with which they held each other through the good things, which is the only real definition of partnership that has ever mattered. But on this particular evening in the summer of 1885, sitting on the porch of the house Milton had built on the land along the creek, with the smell of supper still on the air and the sound of the children asleep inside, Irene Sawyer Ralston held her husband's hand and looked out at the enormous Texas sky and felt, without qualification and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had come off a stagecoach in April of 1878 with $43 and a fierce determination, and a plan that had immediately failed. She had found a school that needed teaching and a town that needed building and a man who was looking at the horizon with the same quality of patient intention that she had been looking at it herself, and together they had turned their faces in the same direction and walked. And this was where they had arrived, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything she had ever worked toward, made real and solid and warm on a summer evening in Texas, with the creek running and the horses in the pasture, and the stars coming out one by one above the endless, generous plain. Milton turned his head and looked at her in the dark, and she looked back at him, and they did not need any words for it, because they had already spoken all the words that mattered and would speak them again 1,000 more times in the years ahead. And in the spaces between the words was the life they had built, real and whole and fully theirs.